What's so retro about Foma's Retropan 320? I wanted to do some more film comparisons to Tri-X like I began earlier in the year. But to keep things consistent, rather than do them every now and then, I went ahead and got 49 different film stocks, everything I could get in 35mm from B&H and Freestyle. So unless they were out of stock, I got a roll of it. Now, if this part of the video seems familiar, it's because I'm using this portion of the video for all 49 of them rather than record it 49 times. So if you want to skip ahead to the H&D curves or the prints, time codes are right over here. For those of you that haven't seen this part of the video before, here's what I've done. So I wanted to use each film with the exact same shot, which is a headshot of me with a Kodak Gray Card Plus, which happens to have a red, blue, and green patch, a cyan, magenta, yellow patch, and then a dark and a neutral flesh tone. Then, with those shots taken, I bracketed every shot in third of a stop so that we can make sure we have a negative of equal shadow density to the base target film of Tri-X. Now, the reason I use Tri-X is because it's just been around for a long time and it's a very popular film. So it's a good base film to compare everything to. Then, once everything was developed, which was developed in D-76 at stock for the manufacturer's recommended time, I printed everything on Ilford using the exact same aperture, contrast settings, developer, and everything. The only thing I changed was my exposure time, and that was to make sure that I compensated for any base fog variation from one film stock to another. Other than that, everything was left the same so that we can have a comparison of just the qualities of the film. Now, there's going to be some differences in contrast, especially on the high end, and that's because the manufacturers getting their development time may not have used the same target that Kodak used for Tri-X. And that's okay. We're not looking at the overall contrast for everything. What we're really looking at is grain characteristics, tonality, how the film treats the shadows versus the highlights, that sort of thing. And we're looking at spectral sensitivity, thus the Gray Card Plus, rather than just a regular gray card. So we're going to go ahead and look at H&D curves, which if you saw one of my earlier videos on sensitometry, I like to use pen and paper and make my graphs. However, my wife was really ready to make sure I was done with this project. So she put everything into a spreadsheet for you all. So even though I don't like them, I want to show them to you thanks to her. Then we're going to go ahead and look at the prints side by side with the same print made from Tri-X. And from there, you can decide if you like the film and if you want to go and use it. So let's go ahead and take a look at the curves and then we'll go to the prints. Once again, we have our Tri-X in blue and the Retropan represented here with our red. Now clearly the red line is lower than the blue. That means we have a much lower gamma, so much lower contrast. So I think from this negative, we can expect a much lower contrast overall in the print. Other than that, it's really just, once we get past the toe, the whole thing just seems to be one long, slow shoulder. So I don't think this is very encouraging results for a good looking print. Once we look at the print, we'll see what it actually looks like. But here, not good separation in the shadows with the really flat toe. And then the shoulder just begins very early. So I don't think we're going to have a whole lot of good separation in the top. But let's look at the print. Maybe the chart is just deceiving. So here's hoping. Here we have our Tri-X, and here we have Retropan 320 from Foma. All right, so we can immediately see this is very dull. Now, I don't know if that's indicative of Retropan in general, or if it's just my roll of film that I got. Normally, I would say when you have gray highlights like that instead of whites, it's underdeveloped. However, that does not seem to be the case here. Instead, I think what we're doing is fighting a tremendous amount of base fog. It just was one of the highest base fogs of all the films that I tested. What's the cause of that? It could be a variety of different things. It could be storage. It could be chemical fog, which is unlikely because that would affect several others. It could be just pure age. Who knows? But it did come out pretty lifeless in terms of highlights. So we will go ahead and look at this overall, but the highlights are definitely bland. Now, I will say it did come out with the correct shadow detail at 320 ISO, just as the box advertises. But for whatever reason, we could not seem to build highlight density. What we do notice, though, is our spectral sensitivity is not quite the same as with Tri-X. Here we have, as we saw with Foma 400, a extended red sensitivity, which also gave us slightly darker cyans. So that does kind of explain why our shirt is darker in both, but since the skin is darker in both and the white is darker in both, that could also just be whatever is causing this complete lack of contrast. But we do have that extended red. What's odd is our blue is also slightly lighter than green. So we are least sensitive to green, mildly sensitive to blue, more sensitive to red. Strange response, but there you have it. Okay, now that we've looked at the overall view, let's go ahead and zoom in and see what the particulars look like. And here we can see immediately the grain is much larger than Tri-X, even though technically it's a slower film by 1/3 of a stop. Now the gradation right here did come out fairly equal. It's just our highlights never really got bright. Here, looking at the difference between the shadowed shoulder and the background, we can again see that pronounced grain, but we do still pick up the detail of the fuzzy fabric along that black edge of my shoulder as it touches the background tone. So we are getting good detail with this film. Here, when we look at this shoulder and the collar, the grain now is obscuring the fine detail, as is the overall fog. So we're not really picking up the texture of the fabric of the shirt itself. The grain is obscuring that. However, we can still see the fine lines of the collar, though not as clear. We're also not picking up the texture of my skin nearly as well, or the seam along the shoulder of the shirt. And now finally, with the lighter tones of my skin, quite a bit of tonality is obscured by the heavy fog and the lack of highlight density that didn't quite build up in the film. But when we look at the texture of the skin, again, it is being obscured by the heavy grain in this particular film. So we're actually approaching, although not quite achieving, the graininess of T-Max 3200. But the grain itself, quite large, quite pronounced, and obscuring very fine detail. But if you like the look, it's a good film to go for. I would probably just be very careful with the fogging and either develop longer or try to find some sort of fog reducing agent to add to your developer. All right, that's all that we have this week. Thank you for watching. You can help support this channel through my Patreon or through a purchase of a t-shirt or lab towel, print, and so forth. Links are down in the bottom in the description. I appreciate you watching, and we will catch you next time.